The Ashworth estate lay blanketed in fresh snow when the telephone call came through to Scotland Yard. Inspector Japp listened carefully, his weathered face growing more puzzled with each detail. By midnight, he was driving through the Alpine passes toward the remote cabin where millionaire Edmund Ashworth had been found dead in his locked study, a single playing card clutched in his rigid fingers. Hercule Poirot arrived by train the following morning, his immaculate moustache precisely waxed despite the gruelling journey. The Belgian detective surveyed the crime scene with characteristic deliberation, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Edmund Ashworth lay sprawled across his mahogany desk, a letter opener buried between his shoulder blades. The wounds suggested a crime of passion, yet nothing else about the scene supported such impulsive violence. The study presented the first impossibility. The door had been locked from the inside, with the key found on Ashworth's person. The windows remained sealed shut, their frames crusted with ice that appeared undisturbed for days. The only entrance and exit was through that single locked door, yet 3 people claimed to have heard nothing during the presumed time of death, between 8 and 10 o'clock the previous evening. The household staff swore the study remained silent as a tomb. Poirot examined the playing card with particular interest. It was the Queen of Hearts, curiously unmarked and unremarkable, except for one detail. A small, neat hole had been punched through the centre of the card, as if someone had deliberately defaced it. When questioned, none of the 5 people in the house that evening could explain its significance. It lay on the floor beside the body, positioned too precisely to have fallen there accidentally. The suspects formed a curious assembly. There was Geoffrey Ashworth, the victim's nephew, desperate for inheritance money, rumoured to be flowing toward charity. His hands bore fresh scratches that he attributed to a gardening accident that morning. Then came Margot Ashworth, the widow, whose calm demeanour seemed inappropriate for a newly bereaved wife. She had been in the drawing-room with her embroidery, witnesses confirmed, though she had been quite alone for the crucial hour. The household manager, Mrs. Winters, occupied the kitchen preparing dinner, while the cook and groundskeeper were occupied elsewhere in the sprawling estate. What troubled Poirot most was the weapon itself. The letter opener bore no fingerprints whatsoever, not even smudged ones suggesting gloved hands. It had been cleaned meticulously, yet it remained at the scene. A murderer typically either takes or abandons a weapon in haste, not leaves it arranged with such precision. The locked room mystified even the most seasoned investigators. Japp suggested suicide, but the angle of the wound made such an interpretation physically implausible. The playing card remained the only genuine anomaly, the sole clue that seemed to hint at something beyond a simple crime of passion or greed. As Poirot settled into the cabin's guest quarters that evening, he gazed into the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Outside, snow continued falling silently, erasing footprints and possibilities with equal indifference. 3 people had keys to the study: Geoffrey, Margot, and the housekeeper. Yet none of them had entered during the fatal hour, or so they claimed. The playing card lay on his desk, that inexplicable Queen of Hearts with her punched-through face, offering no answers, only riddles. Poirot smiled thinly. The little grey cells were already working, sorting through the impossible tangle of locked doors, pristine weapons, and suspicious silence. By morning, he suspected, the impossible would reveal itself as merely overlooked. The crime that appeared unsolvable would yield its secrets to proper method and order. Breakfast was served at 8 o'clock, a subdued affair in the cabin's dining room, where the family and staff gathered under the watchful presence of a Scotland Yard constable. Poirot observed them all with the intensity of a man studying a particularly complex mathematical equation. He said nothing, merely sipped his coffee with deliberate slowness, allowing the tension to accumulate like the snow outside. Geoffrey Ashworth sat rigidly at the table's end, his napkin clutched too tightly in his lap. He had inherited his uncle's sharp cheekbones and cold eyes, though where Edmund's gaze had been calculating, Geoffrey's now darted nervously between the detective and the doorway. The scratches on his hands were indeed prominent, but Poirot noticed something else entirely. A faint discoloration around the young man's left wrist, as though a watch or bracelet had recently been removed, leaving a pale band of skin against his tanned forearm. Margot Ashworth sat with impeccable posture, her black widow's dress immaculate despite the tragedy of mere hours past. She buttered her toast with mechanical precision, each movement controlled and deliberate. Yet her left hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she raised her teacup, and Poirot observed that her fingernails bore traces of what appeared to be ink stains. Curious for a woman who claimed to have spent the evening embroidering. Mrs. Winters, the household manager, moved about the dining room attending to needs with practised efficiency. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to discretion and order. But when Poirot casually mentioned the locked door, she paused fractionally while pouring tea for the constable, and a thin line appeared between her eyebrows, not concern, precisely, but calculation. After breakfast, Poirot requested to examine the study once more, this time with Geoffrey present. The young man's breathing became noticeably shallow as they entered the room where his uncle's body had been discovered. Poirot moved methodically through the space, running his fingers along the bookshelves with apparent aimlessness. He paused at a particular shelf, noting the absence of dust in a rectangular section, where a book, or perhaps something else, had recently rested. "Tell me, Monsieur Geoffrey," Poirot said softly, "your uncle was a collector, yes? What exactly did he collect?" Geoffrey hesitated. "Cards, actually. Playing cards. Vintage decks, rare editions. He had quite a valuable collection." Poirot's eyebrow rose with interest. "Cards? How fascinating! And where might this collection be kept?" "In the safe, behind the portrait." Geoffrey gestured toward the wall. When Poirot opened the safe's door, he found it nearly empty save for some documents and a leather-bound journal. The space that should have housed a card collection was conspicuously vacant. "When was the collection last inventoried?" Poirot asked. I don't know precisely. Uncle kept it very private." But Poirot had already noticed something else. A single card remained on the shelf within the safe, carefully positioned. He removed it delicately. It was another Queen of Hearts, identical to the one found at the crime scene, complete with its peculiar punched hole. Yet this card bore something the other lacked, a date written in faded ink on its reverse, December 24th, 1895. Poirot turned to Geoffrey, whose face had gone nearly white. "It appears, monsieur, that your uncle's death was not merely a crime of passion. Someone knew precisely what they were looking for. The question now becomes, who else knew of this collection? And more importantly, who knew the significance of these particular cards?" Poirot convened individual interviews in the cabin's library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed to absorb sound and secrets with equal efficiency. Inspector Japp positioned himself in the corner, notebook in hand, occasionally exchanging glances with the detective when inconsistencies surfaced. The afternoon light filtered weakly through frost-covered windows as each suspect entered and departed, leaving behind trails of half-truths and evasions. Geoffrey was summoned first, his earlier pallor having deepened into something approaching genuine fear. When asked directly about the card collection's value, he admitted his uncle had mentioned it casually, a fortune in vintage decks worth perhaps £50,000. Yet when pressed about whether he had ever expressed financial desperation to anyone in the household, Geoffrey's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Never." "My uncle knew I was financially stable." Poirot noted the phrasing. Not that he hadn't needed money, but that his uncle had known he was stable. A careful distinction. Margot proved more challenging to unsettle. She maintained her composure throughout, speaking in measured tones about her husband's eccentricities and his obsessive nature regarding his collections. When asked if she had ever attempted to access the safe, she smiled thinly. "My dear detective, I respected my husband's privacy absolutely. Such things were his concern, not mine." Yet her fingers betrayed her, twisting the emerald ring on her left hand repeatedly, and when Poirot mentioned the ink stains on her nails, her explanation, that she had been writing Christmas cards earlier in the day, contradicted what the household cook had stated that Margot had been. Embroidering continuously from 7 o'clock onward, Mrs. Winters presented herself with the calm of a woman who had weathered many storms. She confirmed hearing nothing from the study during the crucial hour, as the kitchen was occupied with final dinner preparations, and the radio played music that would have muffled any sounds from the study's direction. Yet when Poirot asked if she had ever been asked to clean or maintain the study, her response contained a curious omission. She mentioned cleaning it weekly, but when asked about the last cleaning, she suddenly became vague about the specific day. Perhaps Tuesday or Wednesday, she said, though the constable's preliminary investigation had established the cleaning occurred on Mondays without fail. The groundskeeper, a taciturn man named Graves, provided the most peculiar testimony. He claimed to have been repairing the garden shed's roof during the evening, working by lamplight until nearly 9 o'clock. Yet his hands bore no fresh calluses or splinters that such work would require, and when asked about the specific repairs, his descriptions lacked the detail a man engaged in actual labour would possess. "Just fixing the frame," he said vaguely, contradicting himself moments later by mentioning he'd replaced several boards. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, proved the most forthright, though even her account contained odd gaps. She had prepared dinner, she confirmed, working steadily in the kitchen where she could hear the hallway clock chime the hour. She heard nothing from the study, but she admitted she had stepped outside briefly, around 8:30, to retrieve items from the cold storage. When asked what items specifically, she hesitated, then claimed vegetables for tomorrow's meal, a task the groundskeeper had traditionally performed. As the day waned, Poirot reviewed his notes with deliberate care. 5 people, 5 versions of events, and in each account lay the seeds of deception. Someone had lied about their whereabouts, someone had possessed knowledge of the card collection that they hadn't revealed, and someone had ink stains that didn't correspond with their stated activities. The pieces formed a pattern, but not yet a complete picture. Poirot recognised the telltale signs of a conspiracy, not one person acting alone, but rather several individuals bound by secrets, each protecting themselves while simultaneously incriminating others through their very evasions. Evening descended upon the cabin with the weight of accumulated secrets. Poirot sat alone in his quarters, spreading the facts before him like cards in a game of solitaire. The 2 queens of hearts lay at the centre, one from the crime scene, one from the safe, their identical punch holes suggesting deliberate symbolism. But symbolism required understanding, and understanding demanded motive. He began constructing the web methodically. Geoffrey's financial situation, upon deeper investigation by Japp's men, proved less stable than the young man had claimed. A telegram arrived confirming that Geoffrey had placed substantial bets on racing horses, accumulating debts to questionable creditors. The inheritance would solve everything, yet Geoffrey possessed no knowledge of safes or combinations, and his scratched hands upon closer examination by the police surgeon showed marks consistent with defensive wounds, suggesting he had fought someone, not worked with tools. Margot's motive emerged through a different avenue. One of the constables discovered correspondence hidden in her room, letters from a man named Richard Caldwell, written with the unmistakable intimacy of a lover. They discussed plans, mentioned waiting for Edmund's death, and spoke of finally being free. Margot had motive, certainly, but the letters were dated 3 years prior, their tone suggesting that particular passion had long since cooled into something more practical. Besides, Margot stood to inherit everything, regardless of the collection's fate. Why risk murder for cards? Mrs. Winters presented the most intriguing profile. Poirot discovered that her grandson had been institutionalised for theft, a fact she kept hidden from the household. When pressed, she admitted that Edmund Ashworth had discovered this years ago and had used the knowledge to keep her wages deliberately low, a form of quiet blackmail. She resented him, certainly, but resentment simmering for years rarely exploded into murder over playing cards. The groundskeeper's background proved darker still. Graves had once worked as a dealer in rare antiquities, a profession he'd abandoned after a scandal involving stolen artefacts from a private collection. When confronted with this information, he became agitated, claiming Edmund had hired him precisely because of this history, to authenticate the card collection, to ensure it wasn't counterfeit. Yet why would a groundskeeper be trusted with such responsibility, unless Edmund had possessed leverage over him as well? Mrs. Patterson's connection emerged last and most obliquely. She had a brother imprisoned for fraud, a brother whose continued institutionalisation required funds for private care. Ashworth had apparently discovered this too, and had made her life difficult through subtle cruelties, criticism, reduced hours, constant surveillance. What became increasingly clear to Poirot was that Edmund Ashworth had been a man who collected more than cards. He collected secrets. He used knowledge as a weapon, maintaining power over his household through carefully orchestrated vulnerability. Every person in this cabin had reason to despise him, yet despising someone and murdering them remained distinct propositions. The locked room presented the central puzzle. If multiple people bore motive, perhaps multiple people bore opportunity as well. Poirot recalled the safe's location behind the portrait and the ink stains on Margot's nails. He thought of Mrs. Winters' vague timeline and the groundskeeper's dubious alibi. He considered Geoffrey's scratched hands and Mrs. Patterson's convenient absence from the kitchen. The Queen of Hearts with the punch hole suggested something theatrical, almost ritualistic. A calling card, perhaps, or a coded message. Poirot closed his eyes, allowing his mind to work through the labyrinth. 5 suspects with tangled motives, each protecting themselves while suspecting others. The Christmas season, typically a time of peace, had become a season of suspicion. Somewhere within this web of deception lay the thread that would unravel everything, the one connection that transformed coincidence into conspiracy, accident into design. Morning brought an unexpected development that sent ripples of excitement through the Scotland Yard contingent. One of the constables discovered a leather journal beneath the floorboards of Geoffrey's room, hidden with the care of someone concealing something precious. The journal contained detailed drawings of the card collection, inventory notes in Geoffrey's handwriting, and most damning of all, sketches of the study's safe mechanism accompanied by measurements and calculations. There were even crude diagrams labelled December 24th plan with notations about timing and distraction. Inspector Japp's face flushed with triumph. "It's Geoffrey," he declared confidently to Poirot. The nephew was planning this meticulously. He drew the safe, studied the mechanism, probably attempted to crack it. When his uncle discovered him, they struggled, hence the scratches on his hands. The letter opener was at hand, passion overwhelmed him, and he struck. Poirot examined the journal with characteristic deliberation, turning each page slowly while Japp gestured enthusiastically about moving toward arrest. The evidence seemed compelling, undeniably so, yet something in the detective's expression remained unconvinced. his grey eyes narrowing as he studied the handwriting with increasing intensity. "Bring Monsieur Geoffrey to the study," Poirot instructed quietly, "and summon the others as well." Geoffrey's face crumbled upon seeing his own journal displayed. He stammered, contradicted himself, and ultimately confessed to everything except the murder. Yes, he had studied the safe. Yes, he had planned to steal the collection. Yes, he had come to the study at 8:30 that evening with the intention of attempting the combination he'd discovered through conversations with his uncle. But when he arrived, he found the door already open, and his uncle already dead, slumped across the desk with the letter opener between his shoulder blades. "I panicked," Geoffrey whispered, his voice breaking. "I saw the card on the floor, one of the Queen of Hearts my uncle kept separate. I don't know why I took it. I ran to my room and hid the journal. I thought if I admitted I'd been planning to rob him, I'd be blamed for his death. It was a plausible explanation, one that satisfied Japp's desire for resolution." Yet Poirot remained unmoved, his attention fixed instead on the study itself. He walked to the desk where Edmund had been found and stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, eyes closed, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, a crystalline clarity that suggested pieces were aligning in his mind. "The constable who discovered this journal," Poirot asked suddenly. "Which constable was it?" "Young Davies," Japp replied. "Found it quite by accident when inspecting the floorboards for loose panels." Poirot nodded slowly. "How curious. And these floorboards, were they recently disturbed, the wood splintered, the dust accumulated naturally, or recently displaced?" Japp's enthusiasm began wavering as he considered the question. "We didn't examine that closely. Davies simply reported finding the journal." "Precisely," Poirot said softly. "One plants evidence where it will be found, not where it naturally accumulates. And Monsieur Geoffrey's journal, written with such meticulous care, such elaborate planning, why would a man who had already committed murder leave it hidden in his own room? The guilty party destroys such incriminating documents or flees entirely." The detective turned to face the assembled group, his eyes moving deliberately from face to face. "No, messieurs, we have not found our criminal. We have merely found a convenient scapegoat, planted by someone far more clever than young Geoffrey. Someone who understood that an obvious suspect can be as useful as he is innocent. The real murderer remains among us, watching with satisfaction as we prepare to arrest the wrong man." The cabin fell silent, the comfort of a solved case evaporating like breath in December cold. Poirot's accusation hung in the frigid air of the study like a sentence of execution. Inspector Japp's face darkened with indignation at having his theory undermined, yet even he could not deny the logic underlying the detective's assertion. The real criminal had remained invisible precisely because everyone had focused their attention on the visible suspect. Now, with that illusion shattered, new questions demanded answers. "There is something we have overlooked," Poirot announced, gesturing toward the leather-bound journal found in Ashworth's safe, the one Geoffrey had not written. "This document predates our young friend's arrival at the cabin by several years. The handwriting is different, more educated, more deliberate. Someone else had been documenting this collection, studying its history long before Geoffrey ever conceived his theft." He opened the journal to a passage marked with a ribbon, revealing entries in a careful, precise hand that contrasted sharply with Geoffrey's youthful scrawl. The entries detailed individual cards, their origins, their previous owners, and most intriguingly, their acquisition dates. One entry, dated 15 years prior, bore a notation that made Poirot's eyes gleam with understanding. "The Queen of Hearts from the Vanderbilt estate, 1895. Acquired through Graves. Connection must be concealed. Graves, Poirot said quietly. Not merely a groundskeeper with a criminal past, but someone with a very specific history with these cards. Inspector Japp moved to arrest the groundskeeper immediately, but Poirot raised a hand. Not yet, Inspector. The connection runs deeper still. This journal belonged to Ashworth himself, kept as insurance. But observe, the entries regarding Graves become sporadic after a certain date. The last substantial entry is from 10 years ago. Poirot retrieved a box of correspondence that the constables had catalogued but not thoroughly examined. Inside lay letters from an auction house, letters regarding the provenance of several cards in Ashworth's collection. One letter, dated 20 years prior, bore a signature that made everything crystallise. Richard Caldwell, authentication specialist. The same man whose love letters Margot had kept hidden. Ah, Poirot breathed. Now the past emerges from shadow. Caldwell authenticated Ashworth's collection years ago. He and Margot fell in love during this period. But there was a complication. Caldwell discovered that several cards in the collection were not what Ashworth believed them to be. They were forgeries, acquired through unscrupulous dealers. Graves was one such dealer. Mrs. Winters shifted uncomfortably in the corner, her composed demeanour finally cracking. Poirot's gaze found her instantly. You knew of this, Madam Winters. You were employed by Ashworth long before the others arrived. You witnessed this discovery. And when Caldwell threatened to expose the forgeries, Ashworth did what he always did. He gathered secrets and used them as weapons. He learned about Caldwell's estrangement from his family, about the financial struggles that made him vulnerable to Ashworth's manipulations. The housekeeper's hands trembled visibly now. He kept him silent for years, she whispered. Mr. Caldwell wanted to leave with Mrs. Margot, wanted to begin anew, but Mr. Ashworth held the threat of exposure over them. Financial ruin, professional disgrace. He was a cruel man, detective, a man who collected people's weaknesses like he collected cards. Poirot nodded gravely. And 3 months ago, Caldwell finally refused to be controlled any longer. He wrote to Ashworth demanding freedom and threatening to expose the entire fraud. The collection, which Ashworth had insured for £50,000, was founded partially on forgeries. The punch holes in those Queen of Hearts cards, they were Caldwell's mark, his way of identifying the counterfeits he suspected. A signature of deception. The detective's eyes moved to Margot, whose face had gone pale. Caldwell did not arrive at this cabin by chance. He came at Christmas, when the household was busy with festivities. He came because Margot sent for him, because they finally saw an opportunity to escape. But there was a complication, the letter opener, the locked door, the crime that seemed impossible. Someone ensured that when murder occurred, it would appear to be a crime of passion, not premeditation. Someone made certain that Geoffrey's theft would serve as the perfect distraction. Poirot fell silent, allowing his revelation to settle over the assembled group, like snow accumulating outside. Yet he had not finished, merely paused to observe reactions, to measure the fractures in carefully constructed facades. Now he employed a method that had served him countless times before, one that relied not on physical evidence, but on the human tendency to betray oneself through unexpected stimuli. I should like to conduct a small experiment, Poirot announced, producing a fountain pen and several sheets of paper from his jacket. A graphological examination, you understand. A simple exercise in handwriting analysis. Each of you will write the same sentence for me. The Queen of Hearts awaits judgment. Inspector Japp appeared sceptical, but Poirot's reputation was sufficient to compel compliance. One by one, the suspects wrote the designated sentence. Geoffrey's hand shook visibly, producing irregular letters that reflected his genuine terror. Margot wrote with controlled precision, her penmanship elegant despite the circumstances. Mrs. Winters produced practical, functional script. Graves' writing was surprisingly educated, suggesting hidden depths beneath his groundskeeper's exterior. Mrs. Patterson wrote slowly, carefully, as though English were not her native language despite her British accent. Poirot examined each sample with theatrical deliberation, then set them aside. Instead, he withdrew the journal found in Geoffrey's room and placed it beside the samples. "Observe," he said to Japp. "The hand that wrote these meticulous notes about the safe mechanism. It does not match any handwriting produced today. The pressure is different, the angle distinct, the formation of certain letters inconsistent with all present parties." "Then who wrote the journal?" Japp demanded, confusion etched across his weathered features. "Someone no longer present at the cabin," Poirot replied. "Someone who departed yesterday morning, before the body was discovered. Someone who planted this journal, knowing that suspicion would inevitably fall upon the household members." Margot's composure finally shattered. Richard didn't. He couldn't have. "Precisely," Poirot interrupted gently. "Monsieur Caldwell departed at 6 o'clock yesterday morning, before anyone else had risen. Yet he left behind carefully constructed evidence designed to incriminate young Geoffrey. But here lies the psychological element, madam. Why would Monsieur Caldwell, a man who had just committed murder, remain at the cabin long enough to orchestrate such elaborate misdirection? Unless, of course, he had not committed the murder at all." Poirot turned his penetrating gaze toward Mrs. Patterson, whose suddenly rigid posture suggested the detective had struck something vital. "Tell me, Madame Patterson, when precisely did you step outside to retrieve vegetables from cold storage?" 8:30, she replied automatically, then caught herself. Approximately 8:30, and this errand it required what, 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Yet you mentioned earlier that you had gone to retrieve items for tomorrow's meal, items that would spoil if left exposed to the cold for extended periods. Surely you would have returned before 9 o'clock? "Yes, of course," Mrs. Patterson said, but her voice had become uncertain. Yet the constable who examined the cold storage found no evidence of recent disturbance. No open containers, no items prepared for transport. In fact, madame, there were no vegetables retrieved at all, were there? Mrs. Patterson's hands clenched into fists on the table. Poirot continued, his voice taking on a softer quality that somehow proved more devastating than accusation. "You have a brother institutionalized, you said. But there is more to the story, yes? Your brother was imprisoned not merely for fraud, but for trafficking in stolen antiquities. Your brother and Graves, they worked together, did they not? They supplied Ashworth with forgeries through a network of dealers. When Caldwell discovered the fraud, Ashworth used this knowledge against you all, threatening exposure that would send your brother to prison for additional crimes." Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. He was going to turn Richard in to the authorities. He was going to destroy everything. Richard had done nothing wrong. Graves forced him into it years ago. "I went to the study not to retrieve vegetables, but because Ashworth summoned me. He wanted to discuss terms for his silence. I only meant to reason with him, but when I arrived, the door was already ajar, and he was already dead." Mrs. Patterson's confession hung incomplete in the cold study air, her tears falling upon the wooden surface of Ashworth's desk like punctuation marks to an unfinished sentence. Inspector Japp moved toward her with the intention of formal arrest, but Poirot raised a restraining hand, his expression suggesting that the true resolution remained obscured beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. "You discovered the body," Poirot said thoughtfully, "but you did not kill him. This much your reaction confirms. Yet someone wishes us to believe otherwise. Someone has orchestrated events with remarkable precision." He turned to Japp with urgency. "Inspector, I must insist you secure all materials relating to this investigation immediately. The journal, the playing cards, Ashworth's correspondence, everything must be catalogued and locked away. Someone within this house has already demonstrated willingness to manipulate evidence. They will attempt again. Japp's scepticism yielded to concern at Poirot's tone. He dispatched constables to secure the study and create an inventory of all evidence collected thus far. Yet within the hour, a constable reported that the safe behind the portrait stood empty. The journal documenting the card collection's history, the very document that had revealed Caldwell's connection to the forgeries, had vanished. More troublingly, the leather-bound notebook in which Poirot had recorded his observations lay on the desk with several crucial pages torn from its spine. Someone possessed a key to the safe, Poirot mused, examining the intact lock with undisguised frustration. Someone who knew its location and combination. Someone whose movements have been insufficiently scrutinized because they occupied positions of trust and routine access. His gaze settled upon Mrs. Winters, whose composed expression remained unshaken despite the escalating crisis. The housekeeper had served in the Ashworth household for 23 years, long enough to accumulate keys, knowledge, and secrets in equal measure. Yet, when Japp moved to question her again, she simply smiled with the resigned acceptance of someone who had anticipated this moment. "I took the journal," Mrs. Winters admitted calmly, "but not for the reasons you might imagine. Ashworth kept it as insurance against us all, against Graves, against Mrs. Patterson, against everyone whose vulnerabilities he had collected like his accursed cards. That journal contained information that could destroy lives. I destroyed it to protect those lives from further destruction." "You also tore pages from my notebook?" Poirot inquired. "Only those containing Mr. Caldwell's name and your theories regarding his connection to the crime. He doesn't deserve to be implicated in his murder. He is innocent of that charge, though guilty of other things, of weakness, of cowardice, of allowing fear to paralyze him for years. But he is not a killer." Poirot studied the woman with newfound respect mixed with frustration. "You have destroyed evidence in a murder investigation, madam. You have obstructed justice. Why? Because justice, as the law conceives it, would have destroyed an innocent man to satisfy bureaucratic procedure," Mrs. Winters replied steadily. "Mr. Caldwell came to this cabin with intention to speak with Mrs. Margot about fleeing together. He never entered the study. He spent that hour in the garden room, composing a letter explaining their planned departure. I saw him there when I went to retrieve supplies. He was writing when the clock struck 8:30. He was still writing when I passed again at 9 o'clock. "Yet you did not mention this earlier," Japp protested. "Because I was protecting him from your investigation," Mrs. Winters said simply. "I knew his presence in this house would appear suspicious. I knew his relationship with Mrs. Margot would invite accusation. So I remained silent and allowed circumstances to guide suspicion elsewhere. When young Geoffrey's journal appeared, planted by someone else entirely, I suspect I saw an opportunity to protect further. I destroyed documents that would have led you down false paths." Poirot's expression shifted to something approaching admiration tinged with dismay. "You have tampered with evidence to pursue your own conception of justice. This is precisely the mechanism by which innocent individuals become condemned. By removing evidence, you have made the truth exponentially more difficult to establish." "Perhaps," Mrs. Winters acknowledged. "But the alternative was allowing an innocent man to hang for a crime he did not commit. Some forms of obstruction serve a higher purpose than strict adherence to procedural law." The constable's shout pierced the cabin's suffocating silence like a gunshot. Graves had disappeared from the guest room, where he had been detained pending further questioning. The window stood open despite the sub-zero temperatures outside, its frame bearing fresh scratches suggesting forced departure. More alarming still was the discovery in the study. Margot lay unconscious upon the floor near the safe, a jagged wound across her temple bleeding profusely onto the Persian rug, where her husband had died mere hours before. Inspector Japp's face flushed with anger and alarm. "Mobilise search parties immediately," he commanded, his earlier scepticism replaced by grim determination. "Post constables at all exits. Graves cannot have gone far in this weather." Yet Poirot remained motionless, his sharp eyes examining the scene with meticulous care. He knelt beside Margot, checking her pulse and examining the wound without touching it. "She will survive," he declared, though the blow was calculated to render her unconscious without proving fatal. This is not the work of a man fleeing in panic. This is deliberate, methodical violence. As the constables rushed to assist Margot and organise search parties, Poirot gestured for Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Patterson to approach. His voice dropped to barely audible levels. Graves did not flee. He remained within the cabin. The open window is theatrical, a diversion designed to draw attention outward, while his actual movements proceed inward. He is still here, hunting for something specific. "But what?" Japp demanded, returning from coordinating the search outside. "What could possibly remain that he hasn't already obtained?" "The original bill of sale," Poirot replied grimly. "The document proving that the cards in Ashworth's collection are partially counterfeit. With that document destroyed, Ashworth's insurance claim becomes valid. The £50,000 flows to his heir, Geoffrey. Graves, as the original supplier of the forgeries, becomes complicit in the fraud unless he can prove Ashworth knowingly purchased counterfeits. The document is his only protection against charges of conspiracy and deliberate deception." The detective turned sharply toward the library. The cabin's architectural blueprints. Where would Ashworth have kept them? Along with legal documents and insurance papers. Mrs. Winters paled. "The cellar. There is a vault beneath the floorboards accessed through the library. Only Mr. Ashworth possessed the key. They descended into darkness. Constables holding lanterns aloft against the ancient stone walls. The vault lay exactly where Mrs. Winters had described, its iron door standing slightly ajar. Inside, papers lay scattered across the floor, several bearing fresh scorch marks where someone had attempted to ignite them. But Graves was gone, leaving behind only the evidence of his desperate search and a single leather envelope addressed to Geoffrey, in Ashworth's precise handwriting. "He found what he sought," Poirot murmured, examining the scorched documents, the bill of sale, the authentication papers, all the evidence of fraud. "They are burning. Graves has ensured that no documentation remains to prove the collection contained forgeries. Without such evidence, the insurance claim becomes difficult to contest." A sound echoed from above, a struggle, followed by a gunshot that reverberated through the cabin's wooden structure. They raced upstairs to discover Richard Caldwell grappling with Graves in the study, a pistol lying on the floor near the desk. Caldwell had emerged from the garden room, his letter to Margot abandoned, his patience with silence finally exhausted. He had confronted Graves, attempting to prevent further violence. Graves lay motionless, blood spreading beneath him. Caldwell stood trembling, his face a mask of anguish and resolution. "He was going to kill her," Caldwell said hoarsely. "He was going to eliminate everyone connected to the fraud, starting with Margot. I couldn't allow that. I couldn't stand silent any longer." Poirot studied the scene with the expression of a man watching dominoes fall in patterns he had anticipated but hoped to prevent. The mystery had twisted once more, transforming from a simple locked-room murder into something far more complex, a cascade of desperate acts, each crime spawning the next, each death rippling outward to claim new victims. The cabin fell into stunned silence as medical orderlies attended to Graves' wound, and Caldwell was taken into custody pending investigation into the shooting. Yet Poirot remained perfectly still, his mind working through the accumulating evidence with the precision of a master clockmaker assembling intricate gears. Something fundamental had been overlooked, a detail so obvious it had become invisible through repetition and habit. He returned to the study and stood before Ashworth's desk, studying the arrangement of objects with renewed intensity. The letter opener that had claimed the victim's life remained catalogued as evidence, its pristine surface bearing no fingerprints despite having been wielded by human hands. The playing cards, both Queens of Hearts with their punch centres, lay in separate evidence bags. The locked study door, the sealed windows, the impossible crime, all of it suddenly aligned into a pattern that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. "Inspector," Poirot called out, "I require the medical examiner's report on the time of death. Specifically, the precise window of when the fatal wound was inflicted." Japp retrieved the document, reading aloud between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, with the most likely time being 8:30 to 9 o'clock, based on the body's temperature and rigor mortis progression. Yet, Mrs. Patterson claimed she stepped outside at 8:30. Poirot mused. The groundskeeper was ostensibly repairing the shed roof until 9 o'clock. Mrs. Winters was occupied in the kitchen with the cook. Geoffrey had not yet arrived. Margot was embroidering in the drawing room, and Caldwell was writing in the garden room. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But what of the cook, Mrs. Patterson's colleague? She has given her statement, yet we have not subjected her to the scrutiny applied to others." Geoffrey, standing near the doorway, suddenly gasped. "The cook left early yesterday. She mentioned visiting her sister in the village. She claimed to return around 9:30. The realization struck Poirot like a revelation cascading through the investigation's architecture. The cook was absent during the crucial hour. The kitchen was empty, the stove unattended, the preparation incomplete. Yet no one questioned this absence, because everyone assumed she remained at her post. The household functioned with such established routines that the violation of those routines passed unnoticed. He turned to address the assembled group. "The locked door presented an impossible crime, only because we assumed the crime occurred during the time when no one could access the study. But what if the murder occurred at a different time entirely? What if someone possessed a key to the study, someone whose possession of such a key would be unremarkable, expected even?" Poirot's gaze fixed upon Mrs. Winters. "You possessed keys to every room in this household. Your movements would never be questioned because you cleaned, maintained and serviced every space. Imagine the perfect alibi. Occupy your routine duties while committing the crime at an unexpected moment. Then lock the door from within, ensuring the body remains undiscovered until evening." "But I did not kill him," Mrs. Winters protested firmly. "I have explained." "I know." Poirot interrupted gently. "You did not kill Edmund Ashworth. But you know who did. You protected the guilty party, just as you attempted to protect Caldwell and Mrs. Patterson. The cook, she was not merely absent, was she? She was absent with your knowledge and tacit approval. She was absent because you ensured she could be absent safely." The cook's name suddenly appeared in Poirot's mind as a presence that had existed at the periphery of the investigation, acknowledged but never truly examined. The woman had provided her alibi, been accepted without intensive questioning, and faded into the background while more prominent suspects commanded attention. "Where is the cook now?" Poirot demanded of Japp. The constables exchanged uncertain glances. She had been permitted to leave the cabin that morning to visit her sister, having provided her address. No one had thought to detain her or verify her claimed destination. In the chaos of investigation, the emotional upheaval of two crimes, and the apparent resolution toward multiple suspects, the cook had simply disappeared into the village, lost among the ordinary population. "She is gone," Mrs. Winters confirmed quietly. "As she should be. As she must be. Some truths, detective, are better left buried in the past." Inspector Japp's anger erupted like a winter storm. "You aided and abetted a murderer? You deliberately obstructed justice?" He moved toward Mrs. Winters with arrest in his eyes, but Poirot's calm voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Before you proceed with arrests, Inspector, I suggest you examine the cook's employment records more carefully, and ask yourself this question. Why would a woman of Mrs. Winters' integrity, a woman who has served this household with devoted discretion for 23 years, suddenly become willing to harbour a murderer? The answer to that question will illuminate everything." Mrs. Winters' composure finally cracked, her weathered face collapsing into something approaching maternal anguish. "Because she is my daughter," she whispered. "My youngest daughter, born out of wedlock when I was barely 20 years old. Mr. Ashworth discovered this secret years ago, through his meticulous collection of everyone's vulnerabilities. He forced me to provide her employment in his household under an assumed name. He controlled her life as completely as he controlled mine." The revelation hung suspended in the study's cold air. Poirot gestured for Mrs. Winters to continue, understanding that the full narrative required emergence from the woman herself. "Ashworth made certain she knew nothing of our true relationship," Mrs. Winters continued, her voice barely audible. "To her I was simply the stern housekeeper who gave her employment and occasional criticism. But he used that connection against me constantly. He would remind me that one word from him would destroy her reputation, prevent her from ever finding respectable work or marriage. He used her as leverage, as he used everyone." Geoffrey leaned heavily against the doorframe, his earlier terror transformed into sympathy. "But that still doesn't explain why she killed him." "Because he finally went too far," Mrs. Winters said, her voice hardening. 3 months ago, he discovered she had fallen in love with one of the groundskeeper's sons, a decent young man from the village. Ashworth threatened to expose her illegitimate birth, to destroy the relationship before it could develop. He told her he would ensure she never married, that he would keep her trapped in his household as his personal servant until she aged into invisibility. Poirot nodded slowly, the pattern becoming complete. "And she came to you for counsel." "She came to me in desperation," Mrs. Winters confirmed. "She asked if there was any way to escape his control. I told her there was no escape from a man like Ashworth, only removal. I said it as a figure of speech, a moment of frustrated anger. But she took it literally. She took it as permission." The detective's expression remained compassionate, yet unflinching. "She obtained a key to the study from you." "I did not give it willingly," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "I left it momentarily unattended, and she took the impression. She had her own key made through a locksmith in the village. I discovered this only after the deed was done, only after she confessed what she had done and asked for my help to escape." "The locked room," Poirot mused. She entered through the study door at a time when everyone's attention was directed elsewhere, perhaps during the confusion of dinner preparations, or when you deliberately created a distraction by going to fetch vegetables that did not exist. She confronted Ashworth, And when he laughed at her attempts at negotiation, when he continued his threats with characteristic cruelty, she found the letter opener at hand. The crime was not premeditated in detail. It was an explosion of desperation finally reaching its breaking point. "The playing cards?" Geoffrey asked. "What did they mean?" "They were her signature," Mrs. Winters explained. "My daughter knew of his obsession with those cards, knew how they represented his collection of secrets and vulnerabilities. She took one from his collection and punched a hole through it, literally piercing through his symbol of control. It was an act of defiance, of declaring that she was no longer bound by his dominion." Poirot studied Mrs. Winters with an expression that mingled understanding with the weight of duty. "You protected her because she is your daughter. You destroyed evidence. You created false trails. You allowed innocent people to face suspicion, all to give her time to escape. But escape to where, madame? For surely she has fled beyond the reach of British law?" "She has gone to France," Mrs. Winters said quietly, "to relatives who will shelter her. She will build a new life under a new name, in a place where Ashworth's cruelty can no longer reach her." "Is that truly so great a sin, detective? To allow one broken soul to find refuge from a man who broke so many others?" Inspector Japp moved to place Mrs. Winters under arrest, but Poirot's raised hand stopped him with an authority that transcended rank. The detective regarded the housekeeper with an expression that suggested he had anticipated this moment from the investigation's inception, that every step had been calculated toward this precise convergence. "Before you proceed, Inspector, I suggest you consider the legal complexities of this situation," Poirot said quietly. "Mrs. Winters did not commit murder. She did not directly provide her daughter with means or explicit encouragement. She destroyed evidence after the fact, a serious crime, certainly, but distinct from the original transgression. Moreover, she protected an innocent woman from a man whose psychological torment constituted a form of systematic cruelty that no court would find defensible." "Are you suggesting we simply release her?" Japp demanded incredulously. "I am suggesting," Poirot replied carefully, "that we consider what justice truly means in circumstances where the victim himself was a perpetrator of profound harm. But first, there is a matter requiring immediate resolution. Your daughter, Mrs. Winters, she has not yet departed British soil, has she?" Mrs. Winters' silence confirmed the truth. Poirot turned to address the assembled group with the gravity of a man pronouncing sentence. "She remains in the village, does she not? Waiting for passage, waiting for documentation, waiting for the opportunity to cross the channel. And you, Mrs. Winters, have been attempting to raise funds for her escape through your connections with the household staff." "How could you possibly?" Mrs. Winters began. But Poirot continued inexorably, "Because I have lived long enough to understand human nature in all its complexity. A mother does not abandon her child to uncertainty. She fights, she schemes, she sacrifices everything. You have contacted Geoffrey, have you not? Offered to share knowledge of Ashworth's financial arrangements in exchange for funds sufficient to purchase false documents and passage?" Geoffrey's face flushed with guilt. "I was going to help her. My uncle was a monster. What he did to her, what he threatened, it was unconscionable." And Grave Poirot continued, turning his penetrating gaze toward the constables who held the wounded man. "Before he attempted to retrieve the evidence of his fraud, he had a different appointment, did he not? An appointment with your daughter in the village, where he attempted to convince her to flee with him, where he promised protection in exchange for her silence regarding the card collection's authenticity." The pieces aligned with mathematical precision. Graves had known about the cook through his position at the estate. He had discovered her identity as Mrs. Winter's daughter through careful observation and subtle questioning. When he realised she possessed knowledge of Ashworth's murder, he had attempted to silence her by offering her escape, a gambit that failed when she refused his proposition. "Inspector," Poirot announced with finality, "I propose that we bring your daughter to the cabin, Mrs. Winters, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. Let her account for her actions directly. Let the law hear what Ashworth put her through, what desperation drove her to take a life. And then let justice be tempered with understanding." A constable was dispatched to the village with instructions to locate the cook and bring her to the cabin immediately. Within the hour, she arrived, a young woman barely into her 20s, with Mrs. Winters' eyes and a haunted expression that spoke of trauma beyond measure. When she saw her mother, she wept openly, crossing the study to embrace the woman she had known only as her employer. "I didn't mean to kill him," the daughter whispered. "I only wanted him to stop. I wanted him to release his hold on all of us. When he laughed at my pleas, when he promised years more of torment, something broke inside me. The letter opener was there, and my hand moved before my mind could intercede." Poirot watched the reunion with an expression of profound melancholy. "You have both paid a terrible price," he said softly. "The question before us now is whether further punishment serves justice, or merely perpetuates the cycle of suffering that Ashworth initiated." He turned to address Japp directly. "Your decision now, Inspector, will define what this investigation ultimately represents. Vengeance, or wisdom? Procedure, or mercy? The choice, as always, belongs to those charged with administering the law." Inspector Japp stood motionless, the weight of authority pressing heavily upon his shoulders as he contemplated the impossible choice before him. Yet before he could articulate a response, a constable burst through the study door with an urgency that shattered the fragile equilibrium Poirot had established. "Sir," the constable gasped, addressing Japp directly. "We've received a telegram from the hospital regarding Margot Ashworth. She's regained consciousness and is demanding to speak with Detective Poirot immediately. She claims she has critical information regarding the murder, information that changes everything." Poirot's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recalibration crossing his features. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Winters before announcing, "Inspector, I suggest we hear what Mrs. Ashworth has to say before proceeding with any arrests or legal determinations." The journey to the hospital proceeded in tense silence. Margot lay in a private room, her head bandaged, her pale features illuminated by winter sunlight streaming through the window. She gestured weakly for Poirot to approach, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "I lied," she said simply. "When questioned about my activities that evening, I lied about being in the drawing room with embroidery. I was not embroidering. I was in the study with Edmund." Poirot's posture remained unchanged, yet his eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man watching a carefully constructed edifice crumble. "Continue, madam." "Richard asked me to confront Edmund," Margot explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He wanted me to demand that Edmund cease his blackmail, to release us from his control. Richard said if Edmund refused to cooperate, Richard would expose the card collection's fraudulent origins and destroy him financially. I agreed to make the attempt." She paused, gathering her emotional strength before proceeding. "I entered the study at 8 o'clock, when Edmund was reviewing his ledgers. I made the demands Richard had instructed me to make. Edmund laughed at me, just as he laughed at everything. He said he had accumulated far too much on all of us to ever release his control. He said he would use my affair with Richard as leverage to ensure I remained compliant. That's when someone else entered the study." "Someone else?" Poirot repeated, his mind already working through the implications. "Yes," Margot continued, her eyes moving toward the doorway. "Geoffrey entered through the adjoining door, the one connecting to the library. I had forgotten the study possessed such an access point. He had been following me, you see. He told Edmund he knew about the fraudulent cards, knew about Graves' involvement, knew everything. He said he would expose the entire scheme unless Edmund signed documents transferring control of his wealth to Geoffrey immediately. Geoffrey, who had accompanied them to the hospital, made a strangled sound of denial. Margot continued inexorably. Edmund refused. He said he would never yield to threats from his own nephew. Geoffrey became enraged. He struggled with Edmund, and in the chaos, the letter opener fell from the desk. When it struck Edmund, Geoffrey panicked and fled. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had transpired. "But you did not call for help," Poirot observed quietly. "No," Margot admitted. "I realised that if I revealed Geoffrey's involvement, my own presence in the study would be exposed, and Richard would become implicated in orchestrating the confrontation. So I left through the adjoining door, locking it behind me. I told no one what I had witnessed. I allowed everyone else to become suspects while protecting both Geoffrey and Richard through my silence." Poirot turned slowly to face Geoffrey, whose earlier expression of sympathy had transformed into something darker, a mask of desperation and calculation. "You attempted to blackmail your uncle, using knowledge obtained through your thievery and your hidden journal. When he refused your demands, you responded with violence. You then orchestrated a false evidence trail, allowing others to bear suspicion while you prepared to claim your inheritance. He deserved it," Geoffrey said bitterly. "He was a parasite, feeding on everyone around him. I was simply taking what should have been mine." "And you allowed innocent people to face accusation for your crime," Poirot replied coldly. "You allowed your aunt to suffer suspicion, allowed the household staff to endure interrogation, allowed a desperate young woman to shoulder blame for your own desperate act. You even planted evidence to incriminate her further." Inspector Japp moved swiftly, placing Geoffrey under arrest with grim satisfaction. As the constables led him away, Geoffrey's facade crumbled entirely, his protests devolving into incoherent rage. Yet beneath the chaos, Poirot recognised a deeper truth, that the crime had never been simple, that the guilty party had never been singular, that Ashworth's legacy of manipulation had generated multiple crimes, each spawning from the toxic soil he had cultivated. The detective stood before the window, watching snow continue to fall upon the village below, understanding finally that some mysteries possessed no satisfying resolution, only the gradual recognition that human cruelty generated consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate victim. The Ashworth estate stood silent in the gathering dusk, as Poirot conducted his final assembly in the study, that room which had witnessed so much deception and desperation. Inspector Japp stood ready with his constables, Geoffrey secured in custody pending formal charges, while the household members and their various complications awaited the detective's concluding analysis. Poirot arranged himself before the fireplace with the deliberate ceremony of a man preparing to pronounce judgment upon the intricate tangle of human weakness. "The crime that appeared impossible," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "was impossible only because we accepted false premises regarding its nature. The locked study, the sealed windows, the mysteriously absent weapon. These elements existed not because the murder required such elaborate concealment, but because the murderer required protection from immediate discovery." He gestured toward the two Queens of Hearts lying in evidence. These cards represented not a random clue, but a deliberate message. Geoffrey selected them specifically because he knew his uncle's obsession with the collection. One card he planted at the crime scene to suggest ritualistic significance, to confuse investigation towards psychological motive rather than financial desperation. The second card he left in the safe, knowing its discovery would direct suspicion toward the collection's authenticity and toward Graves. But how did you determine Geoffrey's guilt when all evidence initially pointed elsewhere? Japp asked, his investigator's mind seeking clarification. "Because," Poirot replied, "the guilty party made a fundamental error born of arrogance. The journal hidden in Geoffrey's room was written in a hand that did not match his own, a forgery so blatant that only someone expecting cursory examination would attempt it. Geoffrey planted that journal to incriminate himself superficially, while the real evidence of his deeper guilt remained concealed. He believed that by providing obvious guilt regarding the theft plans, he could deflect suspicion from the murder itself. He turned toward Mrs. Winters, whose composure had solidified into something approaching peaceful resignation. You recognized this immediately, did you not? Your experience with Edmund's manipulations taught you to perceive layers of deception. You destroyed the journal not to protect the cook, but to eliminate evidence that would have led directly to Geoffrey, while simultaneously protecting your daughter from becoming an accessory to his framing efforts. I acted to prevent further injustice, Mrs. Winters acknowledged quietly. Yes, Poirot affirmed. Your actions were morally defensible, even if legally indefensible. You recognised that Geoffrey was orchestrating events to ensure multiple innocents would suffer for his crime. You prevented that outcome through your own obstruction. He addressed the assembled group with finality. The timeline, when properly reconstructed, reveals the truth completely. Geoffrey entered through the library's adjoining door at 8 o'clock, carrying the knowledge he had obtained through his theft and study. He confronted his uncle with demands and threats. When Edmund refused capitulation, Geoffrey's desperation transformed into violence. The struggle lasted perhaps 5 minutes. By 8:10, Edmund lay dying. Geoffrey departed through the same concealed entrance, locking the study door behind him to ensure undiscovered concealment. But Margot claimed she was present during this confrontation. Japp protested. Margot's testimony, while partially accurate, obscured the sequence of events, Poirot explained. She entered after Geoffrey's initial departure, finding Edmund already wounded, but not yet dead. She believed Richard had orchestrated the confrontation, when in reality Geoffrey had acted independently, using Richard's threats as cover for his own desperation. Margot's silence protected Richard from implication, while Geoffrey remained safely hidden behind layers of false evidence. Poirot's expression grew sombre as he concluded his analysis. Justice in this matter proves imperfect and incomplete. Geoffrey faces murder charges and will likely hang for his crime. Yet the underlying injustice, Edmund Ashworth's systematic psychological torment of everyone within his sphere, remains unpunished because the guilty party is deceased. Mrs. Winters faces potential charges for evidence destruction, though her actions prevented greater injustice. The cook who committed murder in desperation has fled beyond legal reach. Richard Caldwell faces charges for assault, though he acted to prevent further violence. And Margot will testify against her own nephew, carrying that burden for the remainder of her life. He gazed out the window toward the snow-covered landscape. This is the true nature of justice, Inspector. Not clarity, but compromise. Not resolution, but the painful acceptance that human systems of law remain imperfect instruments attempting to address the imperfect consequences of human weakness. The mystery is solved, yet the underlying moral questions remain eternally unresolved. The constables departed with Geoffrey in custody as the winter evening descended fully upon the Ashworth estate. The household staff retreated to their quarters, Mrs. Winters included, her future hanging in precarious balance between gratitude for her years of service and condemnation for her recent obstruction of justice. Margot remained at the hospital, her physical wounds healing while her emotional injuries deepened with each passing hour. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the wind's mournful passage through bare branches. Poirot stood alone in the study, examining once more the peculiar arrangement of objects that had defined this investigation. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany desk, where Edmund Ashworth had met his violent conclusion. The detective's fingers traced the edge of the desk's surface, lingering over a barely perceptible indentation in the wood, a mark so subtle that even the most meticulous investigation had overlooked it. He retrieved a magnifying glass from his jacket and examined the mark with increasing intensity. The indentation formed a pattern, almost deliberate in its placement, as though something small and metallic had been pressed repeatedly against the desk's surface. Yet what object could create such a mark? What significance could such a detail possess? Poirot's mind retrieved a detail from earlier in the investigation, a casual comment made by Geoffrey during one of the initial interviews. The young man had mentioned that his uncle kept a small brass key on his desk, a key that opened a private compartment within the desk itself. Poirot had requested examination of this compartment, but the constables had found it empty, its interior bearing no evidence of recent disturbance. Yet, what if the key itself possessed significance beyond its utilitarian purpose? What if the compartment had contained something of such importance that its contents had been removed with care, leaving behind only this barely perceptible mark of repeated contact? Poirot pressed upon the desk's surface, discovering that certain areas possessed a subtle flexibility suggesting hidden mechanisms. Within moments, a secondary compartment revealed itself, one that the initial examination had failed to locate. Inside lay a single document, yellowed with age, bearing a date from 30 years prior. The letter was addressed to Edmund Ashworth, and written in a hand that Poirot immediately recognised from the journal entries documenting the card collection. The letter's contents made the detective's breath catch with the weight of revelation. It was written by someone named Catherine Ashworth, identified as Edmund's sister, a sister no one at the cabin had mentioned, a sister whose existence seemed deliberately erased from the household's collective memory. The letter detailed a betrayal of devastating proportion, describing how Edmund had orchestrated Catherine's elopement with a man of unsuitable station, then subsequently destroyed the relationship through calculated intervention, leaving Catherine pregnant, abandoned and institutionalised for mental illness caused entirely by Edmund's malicious manipulation. Poirot's hands trembled slightly as comprehension crystallised. The cook, Mrs. Winter's daughter, bore a striking resemblance to Catherine Ashworth's photograph, which Edmund had preserved within this hidden compartment. The child's birth date, documented in meticulous detail within the letter, corresponded precisely with the timeline of Catherine's institutionalisation and subsequent disappearance from family records. The mystery had possessed a dimension far deeper than anyone had imagined. Edmund Ashworth had not merely collected secrets as weapons against his household, he had systematically destroyed the lives of those closest to him, accumulating power through cruelty that extended across generations. The cook was not merely the illegitimate daughter of a former servant, but potentially Edmund's own blood relative, a granddaughter born of his sister's tragic circumstances, a living embodiment of the consequences his actions had generated. Poirot carefully returned the letter to its hidden compartment, recognising that this revelation would only complicate an already convoluted case. Mrs. Winters might not have known this connection. The cook certainly had not. Yet the genetic threads linking them to Edmund through Catherine created a moral dimension to her act of violence that transcended simple matricide. It transformed the crime into something approaching hereditary reckoning, generational consequences manifesting through desperate circumstances. He turned toward the window, observing snow continuing its relentless descent, each flake representing an individual mystery, each snowstorm a vast accumulation of hidden complexities. Inspector Japp believed the case closed, justice served, the guilty apprehended. Yet Poirot understood that the true mysteries often remained concealed within the very evidence presented as conclusive. As he prepared to depart the cabin, Poirot pocketed the photograph of Catherine Ashworth, recognising that some questions demanded answers that extended far beyond the immediate investigation. The Christmas mystery had been solved, yet the deeper mysteries the ones rooted in generational trauma and systematic cruelty, remained unresolved, awaiting some future moment when they might resurface to demand reckoning once more.